Hello, welcome to Talent Acquisition Trends and Strategy. I am your host, James Mackey. We have a very exciting episode for you today. We're going to be talking about how to build talent acquisition departments from scratch while in hypergrowth, doubling in headcount in a short amount of time. What's that like? Our guest today has a lot of insight and has been able to do that successfully. We're going to be talking about just lessons learned from scaling SaaS companies and hypergrowth from a talent acquisition perspective. And also our guest has very unique insight into what it's like having talent acquisition report into the revenue organization, which if you've been tuning into the show for the past several months, then you'll know that I'm a big advocate of running talent acquisitions departments similar to revenue organizations and looking at it from a scale perspective through a similar lens. So I'm curious to see where that part of the conversation goes. But anyways, let's go ahead and dive into it. I want to welcome our guest to the show, Lance Tripp. Lance, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks. Hello, James. How are you?
I'm good. I'm pumped to have this conversation, and I've shared with our audience a little bit about what we're talking about.
Sure.
Before we dive into that, I think everybody here we'd all love to learn a little bit about you and what you're up to these days.
Yeah. So Lance Tripp, again, thanks for the intro. So I'm the head of talent for a company called Enable. So we are a SaaS product company. We have a SaaS platform that does rebate and incentive management. But what I was brought in there for, I've been there a little over a year. I started in December, and Enable was a company that had just gone through a Series B, working towards a Series C. And one of the challenges they had, like a lot of companies in that space, was how do we bring on enough talent? And I was there to pretty much, for all intents and purposes, start a department from scratch and scale it and try to turn a weakness into a strength. So
yeah, that's I know exactly what that's like. I've actually been in roles where I've essentially walked into a void, and it's like, okay, we need results yesterday. And you're working with folks that understand the value of talent acquisition from the standpoint of they know that they need to hire, but sometimes
the talent's important.
It's important, and everybody knows we need it yesterday, but sometimes folks don't understand the work that has to be put in. And so I've always found it very interesting walking into like a void like that, because it's one, it's execution, two, it's setting clear expectations with other members of the leadership team, and then figuring out how to get buy-in from folks that maybe are used to doing something in a certain way. Like they're doing it in a certain way. It may not be working to the extent they want to, but you're doing all these things at once. You're setting expectations. You're trying to build trust and relationships. You're trying to learn why things are being done the way they are. You're trying to build out process and get results and actually get hires across in your first 60 days while building out like a longer term program. And
yeah, for sure.
I know exactly what that's like, man. So I'm very excited to riff with you on that topic today.
Let's do it. Let's do it.
So when you joined, and I'm taking a look at our notes here. When you joined, they were Enable was around 200 employees.
Yeah, we were in December of 2022. We had 200 employees. They were probably a pretty equal split between a lot in a revenue organization, obviously, a lot in engineering, customer success. 200 employees based in US, Canada, and Toronto, and in the UK. So global as well.
I love it. And so
now trying to get into Australia. That was one of my first projects, opening up that office. So
fun. Yeah. On top of it, let's also throw in a time zone that's completely unaligned.
Yeah. Completely one that doesn't work with the other two locations. So So 200 employees. So I was recruited and through an exec recruiter. Was at just a point to make a change and was looking for another kind of build opportunity. I think that for myself, it's a sweet spot, and looked at Enable and good product, good leadership team, good culture. Had the opportunity to work in revenue, like you mentioned, which I'm happy to talk about, and kind of the differences and things that have been really positive, and maybe some challenges there as well as we continue the discussion. But yeah, looking at 200 people, and I think essentially we wanted to, try to double if we could. I inherited one recruiter that had been there a year, just helping to support revenue and an Excel spreadsheet and a which was the main tracker, and trying to hire people through LinkedIn CRM, which wasn't fully implemented, and yeah, so that's what I got. But it's been a great experience. It's been a great journey. I still a lot more to do, but it's crazy to think about in a year or so, how much someone or a team can accomplish when you've got some common goals, and you've got good leadership, and you focus on the right things.
So to dive into it, started at 200, currently at 470 headcount.
Today we're about 480, but
480.
Yeah,
Okay.
we ended the year about 460 something. So
got it. And so let's walk through that journey, right? So
sure.
You walk in day one, or maybe like we start before day one on the job, because I want to dive into, when you say good leadership, what that really means. I think as talent acquisition leaders, it's having buy-in from other members of the leadership team, that they understand what you're trying to accomplish, and they're going to give you the budget. Yeah, I think sometimes what happens in talent acquisition is similar to what happens in revenue. It's like you accomplish a result, and then they say, "Hey, can you keep growing at this rate, but with 20% less?" And
do it again.
Right. Do it again, but let's spend less money. Let's increase our revenue targets, and let's spend less money doing it.
Yeah, absolutely.
We see the same BS sometimes throughout our career, and it doesn't sound like you're in that environment. It sounds like you're in a good environment. So
yeah,
the conversation starting in the interview process, that's when the work starts. That's when you get the lay of the land. You understand the environment. Walk us through that, and then first 3 months, 6 months, like that journey.
Sure. Yeah, so I think when you obviously when you're going through an interview process, you're evaluating not just the job, but the leadership and the company, the product. There's a lot of things that go into it. From an Enable perspective, what I saw with their leadership team is they had a good mix of, I think when you look at startups, you want that people that are entrepreneurial, that the ground up type of leaders that have that vision. But it's also good to have some leaders, or a mix of leaders, that have maybe been at bigger organizations, and I think kind of know what good looks like. So I think the journey, anytime you're at a startup, we may know what a 9 or 10 looks like, but you may start at a 1 or 2, and the goal may be not to get to 9 or 10, but to get to a 4 or 5, and that may be success. So it had a good mix of leaders that had kind of been there, done that, with that, also ground up leaders. But then I also really liked, for one thing you mentioned about, the similarities between being a revenue department and recruiting. There are a ton of similarities. And part of that is, a lot of times people don't see all the recruiting. We deal with pipelines, we deal with lots of transactions, lots of meetings. So there has to be a repeatable process. There needs to be things that you can, from an operational excellence perspective, put things in place and then execute a lot of little small transactions that eventually end in hires, or in a revenue department would be a sale. So, I kind of looked for, does this company, the leaders, did they have that operational cadence? How do they think? How do they work? And I could tell as I went through that process that they had plans for every interview step. And for a company as small as they were, as new as they were, I thought that was impressive. And some of the things they did just from a leadership perspective, and OKRs, cadence, they had me put on a presentation myself as part of my interview process to go over some strategy and put some thought into what I would do, even if it was hypothetical, based on what I know. So those are all really good things. So that's kind of what made me comfortable with making that decision. I think as I got there, that was justified, and the leadership aligned with what I thought it would be. Because I think, don't tell my boss this, but you can have a lot of success, but you need a team. You need not just your team in talent, but you need the team around you and your customers. You need them to buy in and have understanding about what you're trying to do, what you're trying to implement, in order for it to work effectively. Right? We can only swim upstream so fast. So, culture of a company, getting them to buy into what we're trying to do, and how we operate, and how we do transactions, how we interview, how we screen, how we score, how we move things. If you can get buy-in from them early, then your chances of success are a lot more. And I think that was definitely a thing that really helped us scale and be able to build a hiring engine so quickly.
Yeah, I think it's sometimes the best path forward is the path of, this is obvious, but path of least resistance in a sense. And I think a lot of the times, sometimes talent acquisition leaders will find themselves in a position where they're spending half of their time trying to convince the leadership team that something needs to be a priority, or we need a certain way of a certain operational cadence to get things done, or setting objectives and goals and OKRs and these types of things that are also tied to talent acquisition and hiring for different function leaders. Like, I'm a big believer in, each VP company-wide, each executive company-wide should be accountable for their own hiring plan, because, someone in a similar position to our own, we can't influence if a VP of engineering is actually going to follow the best practices of the process or use the tech, or, any of the things that we're suggesting they do. We have, at the end of the day, we're not, those people, those folks don't report into us. So are there OKRs, things in place to ensure that that's part of their performance? And I think, I've certainly been in roles where I didn't feel like there was a cultural alignment, where I had the true understanding and buy-in from some of the executive team members that I feel like they didn't necessarily always understand why I needed what I needed. And I would present data and do this and that, but it became this ongoing battle. So I think, it's okay to educate once, but if folks don't get it, I always say, try to figure that out in the interview process. Go to companies that are going to make talent acquisition a true priority, not just the folks who are saying, I need to hire yesterday. It's okay if they need to hire urgently, but I need to hire yesterday. Here's the budget. Here's, I've given thought to this. What do you need? What do you think our cost per hire is going to be? And you can present as an executive a budget and say, this is what I'm going to need. This is the team. These are the resources, the technology, the agency, whatever it might be, in order to get it done. And you want to get that buy-in up front. And I also just say, like, if you're 6 months into the job and you're still, like, it's like a constant struggle, I leave, like, go find another job, go find a company that is willing to invest in you as a talent acquisition leader, because, we don't want to be in a position where we're accountable for things that are outside of our control. So I think it's, that's why I wanted to start really with the interview process versus jumping into your day one, because really, our job starts in the interview process to distinguish if it's actually the right opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to evaluate, right? Because, like, I tell my team and I tell customers, like, even though we are talent acquisition, like, we don't hire anyone. We facilitate the hiring practice. We engage, we consult, we do the things behind the scenes to get them in a position to make a decision. But ultimately, like, if they want to hire a plan, they have to be the one to pull the trigger. Now, coaching them on how that works, I think providing data and getting to a point where you can utilize real actionable data in talent acquisition is, I mean, extremely important. We can talk more about that later, but, proof points to make them be able to get there. But yeah, you need culture, you need buy-in. Obviously funding, that hasn't been an issue. I'm fortunate for that the company's been willing to invest in the team and the process and tools. Without that, it makes it much more difficult. But you got to find the right opportunity, and I would tend to agree with you.
100%. So first 30 days.
Yeah.
What did that look like? And what did you like? Let's explain it from the perspective of,
other 6 days were rough, but
from the perspective of, like, folks that are, like, you're speaking to people that are thinking about accepting a new position or just have, what do you prioritize in those first 30 days?
Well, obviously, just kind of, meeting the leaders, figuring out their goals, like doing that part of it. But look, here's I live in Texas, and so one of my Texas isms is that, if I'm riding to town on a horse, I may want a faster horse, but if I don't have one ready to take me there, I better stay on the one I've got, because it's better than walking. So you don't want to go in and feel like you have to reinvent everything day one. Find out what they're doing, find out what works, find out what doesn't, and try to build on that what works. I mean, even where I'm at now, I had leaders tell me, like, hey, I appreciate you guys being here, but don't get in my way, because what I think I've done has worked some. And, like, fair, very, very fair. Like, if that's worked for you, the last thing I want to do is get in the way. Let's figure out what you're doing and how can I put in something that can take it forward and to accelerate it. And eventually, like, with that person, like, you earn trust, and then now it's like you guys do all of it. But early on it was that. So, you're not going to make, you've got to make one hire than two hires. So start there and figure that out. So leaders, current process, quick wins. What can I do to improve what they currently have? I walked in without really any technology, so that was a really early thing that I had to get in place. So putting an ATS system in, building some processes around that was a tough early lift, but that's critically important as well. And then, having leadership that understands like you have to have some of those tools to be able to do things and do it quickly. There's no way we could scale to what we've done now if we didn't have good tools.
What tech did you put in?
A Lever is our ATS.
Lever? Okay, cool.
Yeah, so that they had already purchased it. But I had actually, my last company had evaluated Lever with a couple of their tools and it was definitely happy with that choice, and it's been great. So
do you have any other, like, what's your, like, the whole tech stack look like?
Tech stack. So Lever's the ATS. We use LinkedIn. We have connectors to job sites like in Indeed and some other global ones. We've evaluated looking at some interview selection tools, interview process tools. I haven't put anything in there yet. And then from an HR perspective, it's Dayforce. So it's not connected, not integrated. So any kind of reporting and that from an ATS to a people perspective, I work with the HR team for that.
Gotcha. And what is, like, were there any key things that you would say are notable or important that you built out in Lever? Like like critical processes or like reports? Like what are the top of mind things that you'd recommend to folks?
Yeah, I think number one thing is your workflow and having a good understanding of what that looks like and what that is. And I think most companies, the workflow from hiring, maybe based on a culture of a group or a VP or a leader, also based on just the role. The revenue is not engineering, right? Mm-hmm. So understanding what that workflow is, building it out, and then having you and your team and really being diligent about making sure that workflow sticks when it goes to moving a candidate through. Because most of the data that you're going to get that's really going to be actionable early is that. How do candidates hit each step? How do they move through the process? What's the candidate flow through that? What's your pipeline look like? Where are the challenges? Where are things moving well or not? Things like that.
Yeah.
So workflow is pretty important.
And one, just to slow down on that too, before we move on, like,
sure.
One of the biggest lessons or most helpful lessons that I learned, and I'm pretty sure you could do this in Lever. I'm more familiar with Greenhouse. That's
sure.
Like all of our recruiters are trained in Greenhouse. A lot of them worked with Lever, but like that's, part of our onboarding and internal process is working with Greenhouse too. And like one of the things that we started doing for our customers, we probably had done like probably close to like 15 Greenhouse implementations at this point. Which at this point is like it's not very difficult for us, quite honestly. For like a startup growth stage, it's just not that good. Most of our clients don't have like a data stack on top. So it's pretty straightforward. But we from the workflows, we got really good at, okay, you want a skeleton stage structure, which we broke into like 4 different stages. So we literally just called stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4. And those were kind of the overarching skeleton buckets, if you will. And in Greenhouse, you can put interviews within the stages or within the buckets. And that was a big game changer from a reporting perspective, because we could have the same skeleton stages for engineering and sales, literally every role that was opened up company wide. But then the way we'd give flexibility to different departments and leaders is they could put custom interviews within each of the stages. The stage 1 was always like recruiter screening or first round. Stage 4 was always final round. If there weren't 4 rounds, they would just skip one.
Correct. That's what we do as well.
That's what
essentially, yeah. I mean, we literally have L1. We have a recruiter screen, but not every role for us has a recruiter screen. I mean, we have certain roles that we can use knockout questions and automations to push it through. So, but it's recruiter screen, L1, L2, L3. We have a presentation phase. We actually have a presentation prep phase, which is kind of a manual process, just how we do interviews, and then a presentation.
Is that like skeleton, or is that like that's literally for every role?
It's a skeleton. We have one workflow for the whole company.
Yeah.
So a lot of times that you may, as a company, you can buy different workflows for departments, but even that it's another layer of complexity. We have one workflow skeleton, and then from a recruiting standpoint, we know to skip, and we know which ones, if this happens, then this is what we do. So like the presentation prep phase for us is, so we'll do a lot of briefs, or we'll have our reps do mock interviews or mock first calls. So my team is responsible. We set that initial interview with a candidate to brief them on, hey, this is what the next step is going to be. And then let's look at calendars, because this is usually a multiple person interview. But we want to know how long that takes. Like if our time to hire is, our target for us is like 30 days from application to through, like where are they getting stuck? And is this something that we need to speed up, or what can we do to make this more effective? Or we're constantly looking at those things to how can we decrease the time to hire? And that's a step for us. It's time consuming, but we want to look at that.
Yeah, no, I mean, time to hire and conversion rates and all, understanding where candidates are falling off in the funnel. And I mean, I mean, you need to be able to segment pipelines by department, but I still like the same workflow company wide, unless you have like a full-time data analyst. I mean,
I don't have that.
Most of companies that are like startup growth stage are not going to have that.
Yeah, you don't.
But you want that skeleton company-wide structure. You want there to be customization for different departments and openings. You need to be able to filter by department. You look kind of an aggregate company-wide, but you want to filter by department so you can look at time to hire, conversion rates, and cost per hire, and all of those different metrics on a per department basis. And then to go a step further, you want to be able to segment out cost per hire by cost per source. So you want to know what's the cost if we're doing LinkedIn outbound messaging versus like referral versus agency. Obviously, is going to be a huge discrepancy in pricing. So you want to know the cost per source, and a step further, you want to know the conversion rate funnel, because there are some
sources that are better than others.
And it's not just about cost. It typically is somehow tied back to cost. But one other correlation you have to look at is how much time and activity needs to go on to creating that hire. If you have a conversion rate where it's like, hundreds of folks are going through a funnel to get one hire, even if that source is accounting for like 10% of hires or 20% of hires, is that actually scalable? Like maybe it worked when you were at 50 people, now you're at 400. Do you have the bandwidth?
Absolutely.
For that source?
Yeah, and where do you focus your time? I mean, it's like, a couple of examples of that I think that we had early on is, so our AEs, we do a presentation phase. They run a first call meeting, and we were seeing a lot of them were either dropping out before they did their call, or they were dropping out during their call. And then we also scale the interviews as well and score them. What we found is like the demo phase was knocking people out. So for us, it's like, hey, we've right. Not everyone had the demo. Not all of them even had an environment ready. So it made them a little anxious to do it, because they didn't feel they were prepared as they could be, and they wouldn't show as well. And then part of it was, it just wasn't scoring well. So we're like, we can train on demos. So we dropped that out, and we saw it went from about 25 or 30 to about 40, which that may not sound like a lot, but when you run it through a lot, that's a significant change when it comes to like the end product and the drop in that funnel.
It is. And like one thing that I think people also don't understand with funnel conversion rates is, if let's say you have 4 or 5 stages to your funnel, if you can improve each stage by 2%, that's an overall 10% increase in conversion.
Huge.
Like, so it's also, I think people are like, oh, we have to find these big levers. It's like when you have a structure built out, making small tweaks can make a huge difference. If you make small tweaks in different parts of your funnel, it could have
Atomic Habits. Plug for that book.
Yeah. I haven't read that one. Is it good?
It's been a couple of years since I read it, but it's about small changes can have significant impacts, and sometimes they do at scale. Like you don't even realize those little tweaks have made a big difference.
Oh, that's a big. It's weird. Like at this point, scaling my company, I do feel like I focus on fewer, more strategic decisions, but getting from like 0 to 2 million, and also standing up in revenue for my company, that back when we were doing that, it was 1,000 lead bullets, right? Like Ben Horowitz, like The Hard Thing About Hard Things, which is one of the best startup books of all time. Have you read it?
No, I haven't. I'll have to do that.
It's so damn good. Like it's like the war stories, the advice. I actually have it right here. I need to read it again, but it's buy this book. I didn't.
Okay, I'll do it. I'll do it. I've got some credits on Amazon.
yeah. It's just entertaining as hell. Like I learned a lot, but I just enjoyed it. Like it was just fun. He tells like war stories about like almost going out of business and like how they overcame that. But he has this concept of like everybody's looking for magic bullets, right? And
Yeah.
he's like, fuck that. Like the way you win is 1,000 lead bullets. And that's essentially his
Hey,
philosophy.
look, people, and my boss, I report to the head of revenue. A lot of, to me, it's like talent acquisition. People, like, they want to think there's some kind of magic sauce. And I'm like, most people know what you and I need to do at a certain, it's not that much different. There's no like, a lot of it's like hustle and execution. I mean, if you have a team that's committed, that works hard, that hustles, that's responsive to customers, and they grind and they do that, I'm like, you're probably going to have some success. So, no, maybe not 1,000 magic bullets,
Right. Maybe not 1,000.
but still, it's like, yeah, there's a lot of it's just operational excellence and grinding things out.
Operational excellence. That is like, that was 0 to 2 million in revenue and building out orgs from scratch. Like I feel like I said that shit every day to my leadership team and to my recruiters. It was just, that's how we win. Like this is a machine that we need to optimize, and the team around that machine is what is like the fuel for that. And
think about in a TA. I mean, it's not much different than revenue. Like, think about how many. I mean, I could look it up, and we've done thousands of interviews.
Yeah.
I mean, we'll I mean, and in the last year, so it's, can you build even your interviews? Do you know how to structure your interviews? Can you make them repeatable? Does everyone on my team have a certain structure for how they're looking at this? Because then what you see is, in the candidates that come out of there, there's more alignment there. There's more continuity. And then everything you do, if you can repeat it and make it the same or as similar as you can, what you get on the other end is much more efficient.
Well, yeah. And a lot of talent acquisition leaders, like I think it's sometimes if they're under budgeted or they don't have enough team members, they have a really hard time having the time to implement consistent like screenings or first round interviews or custom interviews for each role company wide. The hardest part though is the shift. And there's two hard things about that: the time and then the buy-in factor.
Sure.
But when, it's so worth getting the buy-in, because when you come out the other side of that, typically hiring managers and leaders, they start to see the value. They start to see, oh, like rinse, repeat. We open a role, we know what to do. We're not, we're making sure we're getting the best people forth in our interview process, not just like the slick interviewers, right? That just know how to talk. And which, believe it or not, and in my opinion, you could be a great recruiter, but you could still get fooled by that stuff if you don't have if you don't have a robust process in place to ask the same questions in the right way, then you're not going to be able to.
I mean, like, revenue is a great example of that. Like hiring salespeople. People don't realize that it's challenging because on paper, a lot of them don't look different. I mean, there's so many little things. If they're going to fit for what you do, there's lots of little things you have to look at. So you got to get pretty granular there. And a lot of times they're good at interviewing because that's what they do for a living, essentially.
Yeah. Oh, but, I totally agree.
I have one of the guys on my team. He like good interviewers. He has a thing where it's like, if you look at someone's LinkedIn profile, like the less they have on there probably means they're a better candidate, because they don't, sometimes the best interviewers aren't necessarily the best ones to get a job. They're good at interviewing because they've moved a lot,
Yeah. I think it's like, how analytical are they? And I when I was recruiting sales folks, like I really focused on the numbers, and I would slice and dice numbers like 10 different ways and make sure they added up and they made sense to me. And, how granular can they get with their process and nuance they can get with different customers and buyer personas. And I'd ask all those questions in a way where they kind of correlated back to one another, where it was like built-in checks and balances, if you will.
Yeah. They need to understand process and how deals work. I mean, like for, if they don't know their quota, or they can't, like, if I can't work that back, well, your quota is what, but your average deal size is X. And how many deals do you do? Like,
yeah. So by the way,
you weren't hitting your number. It sounds like you weren't.
By the way, that's how you hire recruiters, for everybody tuning in. It's like the same process that you have for hiring sales folks has to be, because a lot of people have this bias towards talent acquisition too. It's like, oh, it's about relationships. And it's like, oh yeah, I mean, you have to be you have to have that engaging, emotional intelligence, which was a buzzy term, especially a few years ago. But you have to have that engaging. You have to be able to sell the story of the company and how it's well positioned in the future, and you have to be able to do that stuff. And also it's analytical. You have to know your numbers. You have to know what inputs lead to outputs. You need to know your time, the amount of time it's going to take, your conversion rates. Why are you losing candidates?
Yeah.
Like what are the top 3 reasons you're losing candidates for this search? Like hiring managers need to know that, recruiters need to know that. And what's the feedback loop look like? And are any of those things, can we change those things?
Yeah.
What's the objection handle? I mean, all of those things need to
You
be
have to be analytical to do it. Yeah, I totally agree completely.
It's like the same. It's like the freaking same thing. Like hiring recruiters and good salespeople. Honestly.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a ton of similarities.
Right. I'm not gonna say it's the same. Maybe same is too, like it's not the same, but there are a ton of similarities, as you put it. It's more accurate.
Well, I mean, it's a repetition, it's process. I think probably what you're talking about too is even for me, like I think it's helped me some of my career, just being analytical, being tools. And I believe me, I went out through college, I had no idea I had that in me, but yeah, something clicks and you have that, but it helps understanding big picture and how you need to structure things, and because process is important. So but that, going, not to change the subjects, but
go for it.
Having like a reporting into revenue has been great for that, because revenue, and like my revenue leader, like we literally, when I started, we like twice a week we reviewed pipeline. So that's what we did. We would go in and look at candidates, we look at where's the flow, how much in, how much out, what's our transition, where are we losing people, what do we need to change, what can we adjust, right? And at the end, what's the end, what's the hires look like?
Yeah.
And then as we go, we make little tweaks, right? Like, I mean, like one of the things we're doing right now is that we have a certain culture, right? We have people that not just can do the job, but fit in well with our culture. So can we give a realistic job preview to understand, hey, here's what it's like. There are things that are great here. There are things that are really tough here. If you don't like the things that are tough here, then this is probably not the right fit for you. We would rather have someone self-select out before they get to that last stage, or even at worst, hire on and realize it's not a good fit for them. So what can we do along these steps to make sure we're having these conversations, we're reinforcing this culture, what it's like, what KPIs are, what metrics are for a revenue team, so that we're getting good fits, even if that sacrifices our conversion rate at the end.
Well, I think that's true. It's like you have to make sure your top of funnel is tight if you're going to have high conversion rates down funnel. Sure. If you don't like, and that's like another nuanced thing, like walking into an environment, how tight and on point is that process? What are the quality of folks that are applying, that are being brought into your funnel? And that process is going to determine to some extent what your conversion rates down funnel should be. If you're don't have a lot of good checks and balances, a good interview structure built out, and you're hiring too many folks too fast, or your conversion rate is too high, then you are more vulnerable to building out an organization that doesn't have the right fit folks. So I always,
it's a weak team.
I like, if you look at the inverse, like reverse, like triangle kind of funnel, right? Like I always I do end up optimizing, like starting, I think down funnel first, like who's actively in the pipeline? What are the active searches? Like, what are we doing? Do I have the right checks and balances there? And then you're going to the top of funnel, like, okay, for new searches, like what is that process when we're opening a role? Like what processes do we have in place? Like one of the most impactful things that I've done for a few customers is, what's the checklist of things that you need to do before you open a new role? And there's a list of like 10 things that, we expect hiring managers to put together, like, the role description, the outcomes that need to be produced. What does performance look like? What does onboarding look like?
Sure.
All of these things, and they have to be presented before a role can even be opened up.
Yeah. You need that from them.
Yeah.
Two-way street.
Yeah. And honestly, and like if too much in the role shifts, we had another process we had to build out for one client where if too much in the role shifted, it actually closed down the role and they had to resubmit.
Yeah, look, for those people that listen to this that aren't TA professionals that want to know like how you can help us out, it's exactly what you're talking about. Like I had an old mentor that he used to say that like recruiters are like Subway workers, right? We make sandwiches, like we're behind the scene, we're making them, but we need to be told like what type of bread, what like if you want something out the other side and it's what you like, you got to give us those requirements. So all of those things you're talking about, and then they need to be consistent because there's a lot of work that goes into getting to that bottom of the funnel, and little changes at the end can have, I mean, can waste a lot of time. The best way to put it. And then
Right.
every time that time is wasted, then you're elongating the search because, candidates just don't appear overnight. I mean, there needs to be an expectation of how long it takes someone to get to accepting an offer and then going through the working out their notice period and things like that. So same thing within talent acquisition. It's like, we can have a hiring plan to be at 500 people, right? Or a headcount, but you're never going to get there because it takes so long to hire people versus losing people. You're always going to be understaffed. And the longer, the more you can keep things consistent and do all the work up front, the quicker that'll make your time to hire as well.
Yeah. And again, some of these things they're tough to make that shift, but like putting together a checklist and an approval process for new roles before they open up is, it could be a game changer because basically you're like, okay, and what we actually did is after they would submit that information, we would actually jump on a kickoff call with them and we'd build out, because again, we have that skeleton structure and we'd build in the custom interviews with them. We'd create the custom questions and explain the importance of asking, candidates the same questions. I like one of the biggest mistakes I saw hiring managers make is when they didn't have custom questions, they would ask candidates different questions and come out of the interview not understand, like for instance, if let's say that they're looking for somebody who has a lot of experience, like doing something specifically with JavaScript, right? Sure. And, they say, hey, could you tell me about, your experience or, this situation, which you had to build this out. And they ask about a specific situation, like a situational question, right? That is going to elicit a much different response than if they ask like, hey, if you were in this situation, what would you do? Or, tell me about your experience just in general working with this technology. How did you leverage it? They don't understand that, like in their mind, it's the same question, but it's not. It's the same topic. Yeah. And so when they're taking notes, if they do take notes, but even in, like if they recollect on it, they're gonna be like, so-and-so, he didn't talk about that. he didn't have that experience versus this candidate had all this great experience. It's like, well, and as recruiters, we've always had that, like a hiring manager say that, someone doesn't have experience. You're like, what are you talking about? Yeah. And so it's like having those custom questions as and built out before a role is open.
Sure. I mean, the upfront, right. So we do like, so for part of my requirement is you have to do an intake meeting. And on an intake meeting, we have a form and we fill that stuff out. Some of the stuff being internal, onboarding and things like that, or some of the things are fairly standard, but we'll do that. Part of that is also building out those questions. So within Lever, I'm sure Greenhouse is the same way. Like we'll build out essentially interview templates, but those are critical because as a recruiter, you have your part, but you need to be consistent as well, by the way. But you don't see exactly what goes on in those interviews unless they take good notes and you can see, and then you have a conversation afterwards. A lot of times there's not visibility there. So building out questions, getting your managers to consistently ask the same ones. How do we reduce biases in interview? Because ultimately, again, it's about process and repetition. If you're asking the same questions in the same stage, you, the hiring manager, other people in the interview, what you get out is going to be much more representative of what you're looking for. Does that make sense? Yeah. Otherwise, there's just ambiguity there, and it's hard enough making good decisions, but how can you lessen the chance of making a bad decision almost, as opposed to making a good one? And you do that over and over and over again. In the end, your quality of hire starts improving. These are just marginal little changes, but they can add up to big dividends at the end. And for sure, like that's why I'm not even too big of a fan of people going down rabbit holes. They're like, well, I have custom questions, but then it can go different directions. It's like, no, I don't want it to go in different directions. I want it to be in this direction for every candidate. I don't like it when hiring managers have that concept of, okay, I'm going to ask some of the same questions, but then we go down a rabbit hole or ask follow-up questions that might be nuanced and different. And I think that that's okay to an extent, but I think that in a sense can be
dangerous or introduce bias if they go too far in that direction.
Yeah.
And so what
For
I
sure.
would recommend is like, we'll stick to the script on, your second and third stage interviews. When you get to the final round, if you have a list of follow-up questions based on, specific criteria, that's fine. But, for the earlier stages of the interviews, try to be pretty consistent in what's discussed with each candidate.
Yeah,
And-
absolutely. I mean, it's gonna have better results. And what you're doing is like kind of you mentioned about the questions being asked different ways. If you set it up correctly, then you're asking the right question, right? Like for us, it's like, I think our product, but our reps need to be able to hunt, right?
Yeah.
But if you're not really digging in there and asking the right question, like, do we get the right answer? And then if you don't, then because what we'll do for ours as well is like we'll say, a level 1 and a level 2. One of them may talk about sales process. One may talk about, how much grit do they have and determination, or how you're looking at different things if you're doing it well as well. You're not asking about the same things. You're each interview, and you have an opportunity to dig into one aspect. So if you don't dig into, let's say, like, how are they with hunting and doing some of their own prospecting, if you don't find that out, you could get down to the very end and realize that you've got the wrong fit because you missed it at that one stage.
Yeah.
You didn't stick to the script. And then you may have a mistake on your hands. And then you're going, they said they didn't like the prospect. That's why they're not here anymore. It's like, well, let's go back to the interview. Did we ask them?
Right. You could get the wrong people through the process or cut the right people out of the process. It swings both ways.
That's another thing too. It's like, engineering to like revenue, right? So most of my career, I've had more experience doing engineering and software hiring than sales hiring, but it's, what's important for the role, right? If I'm interviewing you as a rep, I want to see how engaging you are, how you interact, how you overcome objections, how you think on your feet. If you're an engineer, that's not as important to me. I'm wanting to think about maybe how you think, how you solve problems, how you deal with certain technical situations. But if it's not relevant to the role, like, don't focus on it. Like, I don't care as much with what they wear to an interview as I do maybe a rep.
Right. Yeah.
I want to be professional, but I'm like, there's certain things I'm just not going to care as much about. But
yeah, no, I hear you. I mean, I think it's an interesting evolution, just seeing, what's happening in talent acquisition right now. I think just tying back to the concept of, you all running as within the revenue organization and going through the hyperscale. I just can't stress enough the importance of building out process playbooks. If as a TA executive, you may not have time to do the process playbooks, but as long as you have somebody else to do it, that's okay. If not, like the first 3 months, map out process for literally every single part of what you do, so that when you hire folks and start to build out your team, you can hand them those process playbooks, and then they can be the one to maintain it from that point forward. But I think a lot of people underestimate, like for every part of my business, talent acquisition, otherwise, playbooks, process documents, everything is outlined. And
we have that as well.
Yeah. And one is like, when you start to bake stuff into technology, you already know what you have to do and how things can work with technology and how that's going to work. And then when you optimize, they're live documents. You have to continuously update. Yep. So that's really important. The other reason it's important is because when you onboard new people, you want to be able to hand them those, and you don't want to verbally explain shit all of the time. Like, you want to explain follow-up context if need be, but the idea is like, can we build a process document that's so good that if I had to hand this to a new recruiter or a new, manager of talent acquisition, and I couldn't provide any other context, could they follow this process step by step?
Yeah. Could they get up to speed? Yeah, we've done that with our we do that with all of our recruitment stuff. We're just now starting to do that more for some of the manager things. Like, what are and not that we're not there to support, but part of it's self-serving, whether that's employees or people on your own team. Like, how do you get to a point to OTJ is one thing, verbally coaching someone's another thing, but then having someone to go back to is important. And honestly, there are certain things you may write a process for it and you may forget about it. It's a good way for you to go back and go like, okay, how are we doing this? Or what were we, Okay, yeah, we do that. Okay, maybe we don't look at it every day, like, or maybe this isn't working. Do we need to go back and tweak this? It's a good way to have structure
Right.
to what you're doing.
I mean, so what I'll do, just to give it like a real life example, is I'll say, oh, wait, you know what? This would be a better candidate experience. This would be a better client experience. This would give us more visibility to optimize. Put that process in the playbook, send it to me so I can review. So that way it's in there, and I know that like an idea or something doesn't just get lost. It's actually getting recorded and then it's sent to me. So there's that check and balance. And then the other thing I'll note is, you don't, like, if somebody's optimizing and changing process and making you better, and you don't have process playbooks built out surrounding what they're doing, you are very vulnerable and too highly leveraged on that employee. Because if that person leaves and you have, in the United States, a 2-week notice period, you're in a bad position. So the more that you have process, it helps you deleverage a little bit from being stuck on one person, because a team needs to be greater than one. And you have to be able to plug folks in and out, because the reality is that, people, particularly in SaaS, hyper growth, they may not stay with us more than a couple of years, even if they like you as a leader.
Yeah. I get it. I'll tell all my employees, it's like, look, I mean, my goal is my goal is to, I hope they're here forever, and, it turns into a public company, and that's that option. But a lot of times it's a journey, right? And sometimes part of what you do and the experience you get working for these companies is you've been through that, right? Yeah. So the next time you're looking, or the next time there's an opportunity for a bigger role, I mean, you want to get to that. I want that for them.
Yeah.
Right?
As a talent acquisition executive, you want to have process playbooks out. Not only is it going to help you drive great results within your organization, it's going to help you onboard folks faster. It's going to prevent knowledge gaps when people leave and being too highly leveraged on folks. It's going to help you just optimize in general. But the other aspect is that you want to build out these playbooks so that when you go to a new position, you have a fat stack of documents that explain exactly how you're going to generate results. And, we don't interview as much in person anymore, but it's like the concepts you want to be able to show.
Well, yeah. I mean,
slam that on the table and be like, this is how I operate my department. I have process built out for everything. I'm going to plug, obviously we need to optimize it. It's not just a copy paste, but I know exactly what to look for. I know exactly how to optimize. This is how I build the machine and how I would do it for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
You
got to optimize it, but it's not like you don't want to have to reinvent the wheel every time. Because I'm sure there are companies where it's completely different, but for the most part, it's
yeah. But in SaaS, like I could walk into like pretty much any startup growth stage SaaS environment, and it's almost the same playbook. Like it's just rinse, repeat. Like we know exactly, what we need to do. We know how to build out the workflows, the technology stacks, the custom interviews. We know how to segment from different teams. We know to like all of those things are basically the same. We know cost per hire and cost per channel, and we know how to break that down and put that into the budget. And all of those things, like as an experienced executive, you don't want to be the talent acquisition leader that's just like, all right, we're just going to focus on increasing the speed to hire, but not have a data-driven approach to do it, or not know how to optimize technology, or not know how to run a budget effectively. Like you want to be that executive leader that's really analytical and is a true partner to the executive team. And process docs are a big part to get started on that,
Budgets, I mean, I don't do it here, even though I'm part of it, but the last company I was at, I ran workforce planning, which I'm not I know much better workforce planners than myself, but when it comes to it, I mean, having a plan there and understanding like what your hiring plan is, not just to be able to execute on it, but companies, like, people are expensive, just to hire, like the salaries that they bring in. If you think about it, think about what it costs for an annual salary for a person, and you're doing those transactions like, for 30, 40, sometimes one a day on average. So it's a lot of money spent. It's a lot of time invested. I mean, God, the hours that go into it, not just from my team, but from my hiring manager's team, there's value to that as well. So,
I mean, a huge part of their salaries are going into hiring people if they're hiring at scale for their department. And I think that, like, the last point that I'd like to make, and then I'm going to leave it, hand it over to you for final words before we jump off for today. But your process documents, everything that you're building out in technology, that has to be your number one priority before building out your team of recruiters, because process and technology are ultimately the most important. Because think about like a market correction. Once you want to have an environment in which people can walk in and be successful and they know what's expected, they know the process to follow. That's number one. Number two is, in a market correction like we saw, Q3, I think, was like the low point for hiring last year, right? Like that's our conversion rates, like as like our win rates for acquiring new customers to hire for, plummeted. We had, like, for qualified pipeline, man, leading up to Q3 last year, we had a 60% win rate, which is nuts. Like 60% of the deals that entered our qualified pipeline, we were winning. That plummeted down to like 22% in Q3 from like quarter to quarter. It was insane, right? And so what ended up happening is a lot of these companies, they had to cut their internal talent acquisition teams last year, but they don't have any process or technology built out. So when they have natural attrition, or when they need to start hiring again for growth or attrition, whatever it might be, they don't have any process in place. They have to go find recruiters.
From scratch again.
They have to start from scratch. They don't know what works, what doesn't. They don't remember why they candidates are dropping out of the process, conversion rates, time to fill, cost per hire. None of it has ever been tracked. And then they're playing catch up. And so like what we saw after COVID was basically all these companies trying to hire recruiters at the same time. They couldn't. Recruiter pace skyrockets. You know, they're just constantly falling behind. And if you have optimized process technology, you can hire fewer people to get results, but you also have this baseline structure in place. So no matter what happens to the economy, as soon as you need to hire again, you can plug in a person into that system, and they're able to generate results a lot faster. And so it's like, you know, hiring may be cyclical, but investing in talent acquisition process and technology needs to be an ongoing motion.
Sure.
And that's what I try to explain to executive teams that aren't familiar with talent acquisition.
We literally, I was on training for it this morning. We do risk planning. So we have a tool that we go into, you know, as part of our compliance and being audited. And part of in TA, like one of our things that we do is exactly what you're talking about. Like we have documented processes and playbooks and things like that just to mitigate the risk in case someone leaves, or in case some people are gone, or if you have to really slow down, how do you put it back together? You're absolutely right.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, you got to turn off the car. Fine. But like, make sure you have
you know what's going on.
You have a vehicle.
I'll tell you another thing on top of that too. One thing that I think about, just to take it like one step further, I also think about that in a way where, you know, we'd like to go through an IPO in 2 years. Right. I know, having done that in other companies, like there's a lot of things from a process perspective in TA that need to happen to be able to make that transition. So if you know these documentation, can you take that and go, okay, now what do we need to change in our process to add this extra set of rigor or checks or things like that in order to take us there, right? It's a lot easier to get to that point if you've got a really good foundation of how you do things today. Even bringing it forward, it's really cool. So
it's, and sometimes, you know, we're growth stage or early growth stage, it's like putting everything in writing around salary bands and, you know, career pathing and max salary range, all of those types of things. It's like we're scrambling, we're trying to balance that with building out proper workflows and getting in the right people, and you're trying to like do all of that. But you know, particularly as you become more mature late stage, there's going to be a lot more pushback on salary, and being a lot, you know, that's going to start to get scrutinized, particularly when you're going through an IPO or public. And you're going to have to shift from, you know, when you're Series C and you've raised 50 million, sometimes if you really want somebody, there's some flexibility. But when you get to the point where you're public and you have to hire 100 salespeople a year or whatever it might be, or more, you know, and you can't just outbid the market. Like if you're lucky, you're like 60 to 75 percentile salary. That's going to shift your strategy. And you have to have those, as you said, process playbooks like in place. And then you have to think about, okay, where are we tweaking? You better have a good understanding of your reporting, you know, everything, all of your data, so that you can figure out you're going to have new problems to solve, because the expectations are going to shift, right?
Doesn't stop. It just evolves.
It evolves. It's a nonstop mode. Thank you for going overtime.
Absolutely.
With me today. I was enjoying the flow of the conversation. So
yeah, it was a good talk. I appreciate all your insight to it as well. I think I learned something today too. So thank you.
Oh, we both did. It was a good dialogue back and forth. And it's nice that we've had so many shared experiences, that this could be just a very genuinely interesting and engaging back and forth conversation, which these are my favorite, right? Like I love when I can just have a cool conversation. Like to me, this is the type of conversation where it's not even like a podcast. Like if we were just grabbing a beer together, like we would be having like this conversation, right?
Yeah, very cool. Yeah,
Cool.
yeah, it's been enjoyable.
Definitely. So,
So I'm looking forward to your conversion rate getting back up to 60. So
oh hell yeah, believe me, I am too. I'm like, so Q1 has actually been pretty good.
that's
We're
good.
starting to see an uptick in hiring, which is great to see. We're subscription based, so it's not like per hire. It's
Yeah,
people plug us in on an on-demand basis, so like a fractional
yeah.
recruiter or full-time recruiters. So
But that's good. I mean, that's probably an
yeah,
early indicator to where things are going.
I hope so, man. January was strong. February was about the same as February last year. This January was stronger than January last year in terms of revenue closed. And so the trend is that March should be a very strong month. So we'll see. I don't know. I
Yeah,
mean,
you
it's
guys, you
Q1.
may get a lot of uptick out of that downturn too. I mean, you can see
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, folks cut internal talent acquisition teams. So it's the question becomes, okay, after an initial lag, does that mean that there's going to be an uptick in business for us because folks maybe don't want to hire internal
I would
recruiters?
guess there would be. I mean, I approach that like my goal is to never have a team that's too big to where I can't like ebb and flow. Like I've
Right.
known people in TA that are like, oh, I've got budget, I'm gonna go hire an army. But I'm like, okay, you could,
Yeah.
but yeah, but I mean, can I look at what levers do I have to scale my workforce? Like a company like yours, or there's lots of different ways to do it, but there's you can be thoughtful about it with
I
and
think so.
leverage good partners. Yeah.
I think so. I mean, I like as somebody who manages a P&L myself, like having some variable cost to my overhead expense is very valuable to me right now. Like I don't want everything to be fixed long-term costs, annual
Sure.
contracts, W-2 engagements, because we're seeing we don't know what normal looks like anymore. Like our margins, metrics, everything have been so nuts since COVID in 2021, then
Yeah.
weirdness of 2022, and now what's happening. So it's like, okay, when we're from a financial perspective, executives are running a company from targeting gross margins and overhead expense and looking at keeping those at certain ranges.
Mm-hmm.
You want to have some amount of flexibility within that. And so
Absolutely.
that's like the assumption we're making, but it's not proven yet.
It's
I don't
right.
know
Well,
if
I
that's
think
going to
it's
happen.
right. I mean, so yeah, if it's a plug for you guys, so yeah, I would agree with the model. It's
I don't know, man. I mean, it'll be interesting to see. Like, it seems like a logical assumption that we would see an uptick due to the fact that people are maybe more hesitant to hire W-2 and they don't know, they have less certainty about the future. But, that hasn't been the case thus far.
Yeah.
So we'll have to see like what happens over the next quarter or two. It'll be interesting. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for having me on and really enjoying the conversation. And
And before we jump off, Lance, how can people find you online?
Probably the easiest way is just go into my LinkedIn account. I believe it's just Lance Tripp. All just one word is my tag. But yeah, so at Enable International.
Cool.
Yeah, it's probably the easiest way to do it.
And for everybody tuning in, Lance's LinkedIn profile is going to be put into the description here. I would also, if you were interested in this episode, there's two others that I would check out. The primary one is going to be Brandon Metcalf, who's season 2, episode 1. So I would definitely check that out. And then we have an episode being published on Tuesday. Check out the episode that was published on Tuesday, March 7th. I think that's going to be a really interesting correlated conversation. It's about startup hiring and the nuances and what makes it difficult and comparing that to enterprise. So if you're interested in this episode, check out those. Lastly, I would just say, if those tuning in, if you're getting value from the show, we really appreciate your support and providing reviews. You can go on Apple Podcasts and leave the show a review. Also, feel free to reach out at talenttrends.io and to Mirella at securevision.io, MIRELA at securevision.io to recommend guests, or if you have questions like, hey, how do I do XYZ or implement this into my company? Make sure to send us questions. Connect with me, connect with Mirella, reach out on the website, whatever you want to do, and let us know what you're thinking. We'll make sure to cover it on the show. So anyways, everyone, thank you so much for joining us this week, and I look forward to speaking with you next time. Take care.